The annual Carter Industries Gala was the kind of night that filled newspapers and magazines. It was held at the Grand Regency Hotel, a place so lavish that even the marble floors seemed to glow under the light of the crystal chandeliers. Guests arrived in sleek limousines, stepping out in shimmering gowns and sharp tuxedos, each one eager to impress, network, and climb a little higher on the ladder of influence. But while all eyes sparkled with ambition, one set of eyes remained downcast at the far end of the hall. Lily Carter sat quietly in her wheelchair, her slender hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a floor-length gown in soft silver, chosen by her father's assistant, but no matter how expensive the fabric was, Lily felt like an ornament, placed here only because her absence would raise questions. Her long chestnut hair framed her delicate face, and though she had inherited her father's piercing blue eyes, theirs never held the same fire as his. She was the daughter of Richard Carter, one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, a man whose empire stretched across industries. And yet, despite her title, despite her beauty, she was invisible tonight. It wasn't the first time. Ever since the car accident 3 years ago that left her paralyzed from the waist down, Lily had noticed how quickly people's gazes shifted away from her. At first, she thought it was pity. But over time, she realized it was something else, discomfort. People didn't know how to treat her anymore. And so, rather than risk saying the wrong thing, they said nothing at all. She listened to the faint rustle of silk gowns, the low hum of business conversations, the occasional clink of champagne glasses. Couples swirled on the dance floor, their laughter floating above the music. Her heart tugged painfully as she watched them. She remembered when she used to dance, when life felt light and full of possibility. Now, even the thought of joining them felt like a cruel dream. At the head of the ballroom, her father was surrounded by board members, politicians, and celebrities. His booming laugh carried across the room, but his eyes never once drifted toward her. Lily couldn't blame him. He had an empire to maintain. And she was simply a reminder of a tragedy he didn't like to discuss. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, forcing a polite smile whenever someone's eyes flickered in her direction. But no one approached. No one asked her to dance. No one asked her anything at all. On the opposite side of the ballroom, Ethan Blake tugged at his borrowed tie, wishing he could breathe. He wasn't supposed to be here. A single dad who had spent most of his life working in greasy repair shops, Ethan had only recently landed a job at Carter Industries as a logistics officer. His invitation to the gala had been a surprise, a gesture from his manager, who said it was important for new blood to feel included. But standing here now, surrounded by chandeliers, designer gowns, and people who carried themselves like royalty, Ethan felt like an intruder. His suit was secondhand, the shoes a gift from his brother, and though he had tried to memorize the rules of etiquette, he still felt like a man pretending to belong. Yet his eyes kept drifting across the room, to her. He had noticed her the moment he walked in. The young woman sitting alone in her wheelchair, tucked away as though she were part of the decor rather than the event. Her dress shimmered under the lights, her hair cascading gracefully over her shoulders. There was a regal air about her, even though she kept her gaze lowered. Most people seemed to ignore her. Ethan noticed the way guests skirted around her table, offering polite smiles but never stopping. He saw how her eyes lingered longingly on the dance floor, her fingers twitching faintly against her armrest as though she could almost feel the rhythm of the music. He frowned. Something about it didn't sit right with him. At home, his little daughter Sophie loved fairy tales. She loved princesses, ballrooms, and magical dances. She would beg him to spin her around the tiny living room, pretending they were in a castle. Looking at the woman across the room, Ethan thought of Sophie's words, "Every princess deserves a dance." And yet, here she was, a real princess of the corporate world, forgotten. Ethan's chest tightened. He could walk away. He could stay in the shadows, sip his drink, and go home without making waves. After all, he was just a single dad, a low-level employee. She was the CEO's daughter. Approaching her could mean embarrassment, judgment, or worse, losing the job he desperately needed to support Sophie. But then her eyes lifted for a moment, and Ethan caught a glimpse of them, those bright blue eyes shimmering with a loneliness that pierced right through him. It wasn't weakness he saw, but strength. A strength born of someone who had been surviving quietly in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to truly see her. Ethan's decision was made. He set down his untouched glass, straightened his shoulders, and walked across the ballroom. The air seemed to shift around him as people noticed. Whispers began, some amused, some scandalized. After all, who was this nobody, daring to approach her? Lily glanced up as his shadow fell across her table. She looked startled, as though she had expected anyone but him. "Hi," Ethan said, his voice warm but a little nervous. "Mind if I sit here?" Her brows furrowed. I don't think you meant to sit at this table." Ethan pulled out a chair anyway, settling down across from her. His smile was easy, almost mischievous. "Actually, I did." Lily blinked, then let out a soft, surprised laugh. The sound felt strange on her lips, but it loosened something tight in her chest. They began to talk. At first, it was small things: how grand the ballroom was, how heavy the chandeliers looked, how the servers seemed to glide across the room like dancers themselves. Slowly, the conversation deepened. Lily found herself telling him about books she loved, about how she once dreamed of studying art before the accident. Ethan, in turn, told her about Sophie, his daughter who adored fairy tales and had convinced him to wear this ridiculous tie tonight. What struck Lily most was how natural it felt. He never glanced nervously at her wheelchair. He didn't lower his voice as though speaking to a child. He treated her like a woman, whole, capable, and worthy of attention. And for the first time in years, she felt alive. As the orchestra shifted into a softer melody, Ethan leaned slightly forward. His expression grew thoughtful, almost daring. Then he extended his hand across the table. "Can I be your date tonight?" he asked gently. The words hung in the air like a challenge to the entire room. Conversations faltered. A few nearby guests gasped. The CEO's daughter, the woman everyone ignored, had just been asked out by a man no one recognized. Lily's heart pounded wildly in her chest. For so long, she had been invisible. For so long, she had believed no one would ever look at her this way again. And now, here he was, looking at her as though she was the only person in the room. Her lips trembled. Slowly, almost fearfully, she lifted her hand. And for the first time that night, she chose to be seen. For a moment, the ballroom seemed frozen in time. Conversation stilled, laughter quieted, and the orchestra's notes felt suspended in the air as Lily's trembling hand rested in Ethan's. 1,000 eyes were on them, yet neither of them looked anywhere else. Ethan's smile was gentle, steady, almost protective. "Only if you want to," he added softly, as if to remind her that she still had a choice. Something inside Lily shifted. She had been given choices before, choices about treatments, about wheelchairs, about schools, but those choices always came with pity, with the unspoken reminder of what she could no longer do. This was different. This was a man asking her not as a patient, not as a daughter of wealth, but as a woman. And so, for the first time in years, she said yes without hesitation. "Yes," she whispered, her voice nearly drowned by the music. A murmur rippled across the room like a wave crashing against rocks. Some gasped, some chuckled with disbelief, and others watched in silence, curiosity gleaming in their eyes. But Ethan didn't care. He stood and gently moved behind her chair, steering her toward the dance floor with a confidence that made Lily's heart flutter. "Everyone's watching," she said under her breath, panic flickering in her chest. "Let them," Ethan replied simply, his tone both light and strong. "Because tonight, they'll see you the way I do." The words caught her off guard. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears as the reality of what was happening settled in. When they reached the center of the dance floor, the crowd parted reluctantly, creating a circle around them. The orchestra continued to play a slow, elegant waltz, and for a second, Lily felt her heart ache. She couldn't waltz anymore. She couldn't glide and twirl across the floor like the others. But then Ethan crouched slightly, meeting her at eye level. "Ready? For what?" she asked, her brows furrowing. "For our dance," he said, grinning. Before she could protest, he placed one hand over hers on the armrest of her wheelchair and took her other hand in his, guiding the chair into slow, deliberate movements that matched the rhythm of the music. He didn't try to make it look like a normal dance. Instead, he adapted, spinning her gently, moving alongside her, making the chair part of the movement. It wasn't traditional. It wasn't perfect. But it was breathtaking. Gasps of surprise echoed from the crowd. What had first seemed like a scandalous display was slowly transforming into something else entirely. People who had once averted their eyes from Lily now couldn't look away. Ethan's face lit up as he laughed, spinning her a little too quickly. Lily let out a startled squeal that quickly turned into laughter, a sound so pure, so unguarded, that it filled the ballroom in a way no orchestra ever could. Her laughter was contagious. A few people chuckled softly, others smiled, and soon the atmosphere began to shift. Where there had been judgment, there was now awe. Where there had been whispers of pity, there was admiration. On the edge of the dance floor, Richard Carter stood frozen. His towering figure, usually commanding the attention of every room, was now overlooked as every gaze followed his daughter. His initial reaction had been anger. How dare some low-level employee use his daughter for attention? But then he saw Lily's face. She was radiant, glowing, alive in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident. His anger melted into something unfamiliar, regret. For years, he had wrapped her in layers of protection, believing it was love, not realizing it was also isolation. Tonight, a stranger had given her what he hadn't, freedom. As the final notes of the waltz faded, Ethan stopped the chair in the center of the floor and bowed playfully. Lily bowed her head too, giggling as she played along. For a moment, the silence stretched, then the entire ballroom erupted in applause. It wasn't polite applause. It was thunderous, heartfelt, filled with respect. Lily's cheeks burned crimson, her eyes wide. "They're clapping for us," she whispered in disbelief. "No," Ethan said, leaning closer. "They're clapping for you." The tears she had held back all evening finally spilled over, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of joy, of finally being seen, not for her wheelchair, not for her father's empire, but for herself. As the applause softened, people began to approach. A woman in an emerald dress bent down and whispered, "You were beautiful out there." A young man offered his hand and said, "That was the bravest thing I've seen." For the first time in years, Lily wasn't invisible. She was admired. But amid the new attention, her focus stayed on Ethan. He was smiling at her, not at the crowd, not at the spectacle, but at her. "Why did you do this?" she asked softly, when the crowd had moved on. Ethan's smile faltered slightly, replaced by honesty. "Because when I looked at you, I saw someone who deserved more than to sit in the corner pretending not to care. And maybe, because I know a little something about being overlooked." Her eyes softened. She remembered his mention of Sophie. "Your daughter." He nodded. "She loves fairy tales. And she always tells me that every princess deserves her dance." He chuckled. Guess she was right. The words wrapped around her heart like a promise. Later that evening, as guests began to leave, Richard Carter finally approached. His face was unreadable, his voice firm as he addressed Ethan. "Blake, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said, standing tall despite the nerves that prickled under his skin. "You had quite the nerve tonight, Mr. Carter said slowly, his gaze shifting between Ethan and Lily. "Asking my daughter to dance." Lily tensed, her hand tightening on the armrest. But Ethan didn't back down. He met the CEO's gaze squarely. "With respect, sir, I didn't just ask her to dance. I asked her to be seen." A heavy silence followed. Then, to Lily's astonishment, her father's expression softened. His lips curved into the faintest, rarest smile. "Maybe I underestimated you, Blake. But more importantly, I underestimated her." Lily's breath hitched. Her father had never admitted something like that before. She glanced at Ethan, whose steady presence seemed to anchor her in the moment. That night, when the gala finally ended, Lily wheeled out of the ballroom beside Ethan. The chandeliers behind them dimmed, the murmurs of admiration faded, but inside her heart, something had awakened. She was no longer just the CEO's paralyzed daughter. She was Lily, the woman who had danced, who had laughed, who had been cherished in front of the entire world. And all of it began because one man, a single dad with nothing to gain, dared to ask her the simplest question. "Can I be your date?"